Today I woke up early to finish sewing this jacket for my husband. It's the first time I'm sharing a tutorial for menswear, but it's actually for women too. And I still have enough of this awesome two-sided soft shell fabric left over to make another version for myself. This is a unisex jacket or vest, New Look 6713. An unlined style with front zipper pockets as well as a chest pocket with a flap and adjustable sleeve bands with Velcro closures. This made a wonderful gift on its own, but I also gave my husband another present to go with it. A Ridge wallet in tobacco brown leather. This wallet holds up to 12 cards without stretching out, it weighs only 2 ounces, and it has special security features which protect your cards from wireless theft. Best of all, it fits effortlessly and discreetly within jacket pockets, so he can be wearing both of his gifts at the same time. These wallets are great for men and women, a modern and safe way to carry cards on the go. If you're starting to think about Christmas gift plans, these are 2 excellent options for anyone on your list, including yourself. Get ready to sew an excellent, impressive pattern. Let's get started. Place your yoke front pieces right sides together with the shoulder seams of the upper front pieces and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams up toward the yoke. Now with the yokes opened out over their seam allowances, we're going to top stitch those seam allowances down from the outside, top stitching 1/4 of an inch above those seam lines on both sides. For the pocket pieces, the pattern does call for interfacing. However, I'm skipping the interfacing because my fabric is pretty thick. And for these pockets, I'm going to be using the contrast black color as the right side. So I'll place these pocket pieces right sides together and pin around the outer edges. Sew around the perimeter of the pocket piece, leaving a 1.5 inch gap on one of the straight edges for turning. Trim the seams and the corners. I like to trim everywhere except for that opening area. Now I'll turn this pocket right side out, poking out the corners. And give your pocket a good press. And then slip stitch that opening closed. I've marked my pocket placement line on my left front bodice piece, and I'm going to place the pocket underneath the line. Pin your pocket in place along the side and bottom edges, or you can use Wonder wash away tape, which will not damage your fabric like pins. Now I'll top stitch my pocket in place along the side and bottom edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to back stitch at the tops to secure. I'm skipping the interfacing for my pocket flat pieces just as I did for the main pockets, but you'll want to use interfacing for lighter fabrics. And again, I'm using the contrast side as the right side for the pocket flaps as well. I'm going to place these pieces right sides together and pin around 2 short edges and 1 long edge. I'll sew these 3 edges with my 5/8 inch seam allowance, leaving the top long edge open for turning. Now I'll trim my sewn edges once again, also trimming the corners. Then I'll turn my pocket flap right side out and poke out the corners. Give your pocket flap a good press and then baste those top open edges together. Then top stitch the side and bottom edges of the 1/4 inch seam allowance just as we did for the pocket. Place your flap above the pocket, aligning the raw edges of the flap with the top of the pocket. With those edges aligned, we're going to stitch the flap in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the raw edges of the pocket flap close to the stitching that you just created. Then we'll fold our flap downward along the stitching line and top stitch the flap in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you like, you can add Velcro or snaps as your closure for the pocket flap. I've transferred my stitching line onto the right side of my lower front piece. Now along each of these outer corners, I'm going to stay stitch, stitching right on top of the lines. Now I'm going to clip to my stitching at each of the corners, careful not to clip through the stitching line. Above the transferred stitching line, I'm going to draw an additional line that's 1/2 inch away from the raw edge. Now I'll place my closed zipper right sides together with the lower front so that the outer edge of the zipper tape lines up with the second line that I just drew. If you're using a longer zipper like I am, you can choose to center the zipper along the opening. You don't have to worry about the zipper stops because those zipper stops will be automatically created when we sew the sides shut. Keeping the zipper tape with the 1/2 inch line that I drew, I'm going to baste the top edge in place. I've transferred the small dot markings onto the wrong side of my pocket-facing piece. Now I'll place this lower pocket facing right sides together with the lower front, aligning the dots and pinning in place. Now I'm going to sew through all layers from dot to dot, backstitching at the dots to secure. Now we're going to flip the lower pocket facing to the other side. Adjusting those side top edges accordingly so that everything lays flat. Place the pocket and the facing right sides together and pin along the outer curved edges. Now from the outside, I want to baste the zipper tape along the top edge. Just basting the zipper tape down within the seam allowance. Fold your top clipped extensions to the wrong side along the stitching lines. Then fold the side of the lower front piece out of the way. Align the top edges and pin in place, repeating on the other side. Sewing from the top, you can sew straight down along the pre-existing stay stitching, then continue stitching along the pockets only with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then stitch along the stay stitching on the other side all the way to the top. If you're working with a longer zipper like I am, make sure your zipper is opened so you'll still have proper access to that zipper pull. Now that the zipper is installed, I can cut off any excess zipper tape on the inside. And I'm going to use pinking shears to do this trimming. Now I'll place the upper and lower front pieces right sides together and pin in place. We want to sew this seam so that we're sewing about 1/8 inch from the top zipper teeth. That's going to be more than a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew this seam at 1 inch. Now that my upper and lower front pieces are attached, I'm going to trim that seam that I just sewed at 1 inch down by 3/8 inch. And press that seam allowance up toward the upper front. Then we're going to top stitch along the lower part of the upper front piece, catching that seam allowance as we go. Top stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Place your upper back and lower back pieces right sides together, aligning your notches and pin in place. The pattern seam allowance for this seam is 5/8 inch. However, since I accommodated to stitch closer to the zipper teeth for the front center seam, I'm going to do the same for this back seam, stitching it at 1 inch. If you sewed that seam the same way, you can remove 3/8 inch. Press your seam allowance upward, and we're going to top stitch once again on the upper back side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance straight across. Place the upper front and yoke pieces right sides together with the back piece and pin the shoulder seams. Sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then press the seams toward the upper back. And with those seam allowances, press down toward the upper back, top stitch in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the back side. Doing this on both sides. Place your collar right sides together with the neckline matching the dots and the notches and pin in place. Sew the collar to the jacket with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam allowance downward. For the separating zipper, you want the bottommost edge of the zipper to sit just above the hem allowance of 1.5 inches. And you want your top zipper stop to be 3/4 of an inch from the top raw edge of the collar. My zipper is longer, so I'm going to have to remove some teeth from the top. Once I've removed the teeth to where I need them to sit on the edge of the collar, just use a needle and thread to create new zipper stops right above the topmost teeth on both sides of the zipper tape. Just sewing right above that top zipper stop quite a few times to create a blockage. Now I'll separate my zipper and place them right sides together on both sides of the center front. Making sure once again that the bottommost edge of the zipper sits just above the 1.5 inch hem allowance, and your top zipper stop is 3/4 of an inch from the top raw edge of the collar. We're also going to place the edge of the zipper tape 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge of the center fronts. Baste both sides of the zipper tape in place. For the topmost edges of the zipper tape that will be concealed within the seam allowances, taper that material to within the seam allowance for both sides of the jacket. If needed, apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your facing pieces. Then place the front and back facings right sides together, aligning the notches. Sew these shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Pin your remaining collar piece to the neckline of the facing in the same way as we did to attach the collar to the main jacket. I've chosen for the facing collar piece to be black, so I've placed the black side right sides together with the main facing. Sew this seam to attach this collar piece just as we did for the main collar with your 5/8 inch seam allowance. Layer these seam allowances to reduce bulk. If you prefer, or if your fabric does fray, you can finish the inner edges of the facing all the way around. I'm going to leave mine raw. Place the facing and the jacket right sides together, and I'm going to start pinning with the center fronts, aligning the top raw edges of the collar pieces. Continue pinning down your center fronts, noting that if you adjusted your horizontal seams earlier, the facing will extend beyond the bottom hem of your jacket by 3/8 of an inch. Also pin the collar edges all the way around. We're going to sew the entire facing all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, switching to a zipper foot for your center fronts. Now I can trim away any excess facing along the bottom edges of the jacket. Now along the bottom edges, I'm going to draw myself a stitching line of a 1.5 inch hem on both sides of the bottom of the jacket. Then with the facing still right sides together with the jacket, we'll stitch through all layers, stitching the facing to the front jacket along our 1.5-inch hemline stitching guide. We're going to trim this area 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of the facing and 1/4 inch away from the edge of our seam line. Doing that on both sides. Before I turn the collar right side out, I'm going to trim the corners. Then I'll turn the collar right side out, poking out the corners. And on the inside for the neckline seam allowance of the main and the facing, we're going to line them up at the seam line and pin in place. And stitch those inner seam allowances together as far as possible to those outer corners. I'll trim those bottom center corners and then turn the remainder of the facing to the inside. Now starting from the bottom of the center front all the way up to the neckline, around the topmost edges of the collar and back down the center front on the opposite side, we're going to top stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Place your sleeve right sides together with its corresponding armhole, pin in place matching the notches. Repeat to pin both sleeves in place. Sew the seam on both sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then press the seam down toward the sleeve. With those seam allowances pressed down toward the sleeve, we're going to top stitch on the sleeve side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. With the front and back pieces right sides together as well as their sleeves, pin the side seams and the underarm seams matching that sleeve seam. Pinning on both sides. Then sew from the bottom of the sleeve to the bottom of the garment on both sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams toward the back. For the bottommost hem of the jacket, we're going to fold up the hem allowance by 1.5 inches, as well as tucking the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. Then we're going to edge stitch along that upper inner fold from one side of the center front straight across to the other. I'm going to be sewing from the right side of the fabric, just feeling through the fabric to feel where my fold is. If you're working with a lighter weight fabric, you'll want to interface the sleeve bands and sleeve tabs as indicated in the pattern instructions. I'm not going to be applying interfacing to these pieces. I'll start by placing my sleeve tab pairs right sides together, pinning around 3 edges and leaving the edge with the dots open. Sew the 3 edges for each pair, leaving the edges with dots open for turning. We're sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim your seams and the corners. Turn the tabs right side out and give them a good press. Top stitch around the 3 sewn edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance for both tabs. Place your sleeve tabs right sides together with your sleeve band pieces, aligning them with the stitching lines transferred to the right side of your fabric. The finished edges of your tab will extend beyond the fabric. And we're aligning them so that the raw edge of the tab extends 3/8 of an inch beyond the transferred line. Sew in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Fold each of your tabs over the stitching line. Top stitch in place for both bands. For the Velcro, we're going to cut a piece of hook tape 1¼ inches long. We're going to sew the hook tape to the underside of the tab at the marking transferred from your pattern piece. Then we'll cut a piece of loop tape 2½ inches long. Place the loop tape within the marking from the pattern piece and stitch in place all the way around. Fold your sleeve band right sides together and stitch the short seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, doing this for both sleeve bands. Press the seams open. Then we're going to press the outer unnotched edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. Here is the wrong side of the bottom of my sleeve. I'm going to place the raw unfolded edge of the sleeve band right side to the wrong side of the bottom of the sleeve, matching the seams and notches and pinning in place. Sew the band to the bottom of the sleeve with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'll turn my sleeve back right side out, and we'll fold the sleeve band to the right side along the seam we just sewed. Tuck your previously pressed edge to the wrong side and edge stitch along the folded edge all the way around. Repeat for both sleeves. And now the jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.